Cool. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're back. We had a little bit of a delay with build and a couple of other things, but I'm Joey Dantoni, and I'm here with my colleague, John Morehouse.
Hi, I'm John Morehouse, Principal Consultant with Dantoni and Associates,
Yeah,
and we're going to talk about security and private link today.
yeah, Azure Private Link, if you're not familiar, is a service. It's a service that took a while to come into existence. It's kind of interesting. When SQL PaaS happened, one of the big complaints that a lot of, especially enterprise customers had, was that all the resources were publicly available on the internet. And that lasted for a pretty long time. I don't remember when. I remember when Private Link came in, but there was another. Which we're gonna talk about here in a minute. There was another feature called Network Endpoints. I think that came into play like 2014, if I remember correctly.
You're the one that remembers all that stuff.
Yeah, private endpoints are like kind of a hack solution to this problem. And that problem being is a lot of platform as a service offerings were designed around existing on the internet. It was in the early days of cloud. I think everything was designed about around being publicly available. Any thoughts there?
I think that it makes sense as to why they went that route. I was happy to see the private link service come into play so that we could secure those PaaS offerings, storage accounts, SQL databases, that type of stuff. I've got clients that want to make sure that all their traffic is secured and contained within their own private VNets.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think it's a great solution.
yeah. There's a few things to unpack there. Like John mentioned, it's supported across a large number of services. I was going to try to put the list here, but it is exceptionally long. So most of all of the major Azure data services are supported. So like Cosmos, Postgres, SQLDB,
Key vault, storage accounts.
Vault storage accounts, Azure machine learning. There's a whole list. Managed instance oddly is not on that list, but managed instance can only be deployed into a VNet.
Yep.
So like it's kind of inherently its own private link. There's one kind of key part here to understand. This gets its own private IP on a VNet, and that's a little bit different from network endpoints, which we'll talk about on the next slide. The key thing about that private IP is that it works across peers and VPNs. So with network endpoints, you can't inherently go over. You can only connect from within the VNet that you're in. With private link, you can connect from anywhere. The main reason why I hear enterprises want to use this, and enterprises use these things for all of their traffic nearly, every enterprise I've worked with, isn't so much that they care about the front end resource being on the internet, although they have concerns about that. But firewall rules and things like that can address that. It's more that they want to manage the back end traffic. So they want to be able to see what traffic's coming out of a given database to prevent things like data exfiltration attacks. My favorite story around the service, the first time I had to deploy it was like early in COVID, and this is a really, or maybe even pre-COVID, but I think it was COVID. We had the Pediatric AIDS Foundation. They had a database that was in the Azure South Africa region, and suddenly, for whatever reason, Verizon started blocking traffic to 1433 on that IP range. So I was like, I know how to fix this. I don't know how to get Verizon involved, which I ultimately was able to get Verizon involved. I emailed like somebody who was pretty high up in Azure networking, and they knew somebody at Verizon, and we were able to isolate what happened. But we used Private Link because then we were able to connect over a VPN, and that's really the big element here. And we're gonna demo this. John, do you kind of want to walk through like the setup process? It's not that complicated, but just tell our audience about kind of how it works.
How to do private link?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So if we take a service like let's take Azure SQL Database as an example. So we're gonna attach a logical instance to we're going to enable private link for a logical instance for our databases in Azure. Essentially, what we're going to do is Joey mentioned it already, but in the portal we can attach a private IP within one of our subnets on our VNets to that logical instance. And so that logical instance is going to look like just another resource on that VNet. And then depending on your DNS setup, whether you're hosting your own, like you've got domain controllers in Azure and you're using the domain controller server as the DNS, you can also use Azure DNS to route the traffic. And then ideally what will happen is the resource, like if I have a virtual machine within my VNet, I can then ping that host name, that For example, I've got private link.database.windows.net. I can ping that, and it will resolve back to my private 10 dot whatever IP address that I gave it. And then all the traffic will route over that IP address. It won't actually route outbound and then come back into Microsoft's backbone. And so that traffic is all secure.
Yeah, and that's kind of another key difference between private link and network endpoints, which is our next slide. That network endpoints still use the public service endpoint and have a publicly routable address. So even though like you can only connect from within a VNet, that connection still goes out to the internet and comes back in. Yeah, so that's a key point there, and it only allows from connections from within that VNet. I always put this on whenever I talk about this topic. I always put this on the slide because when I took AZ 700, which is the networking exam, there was a question related to this. And network endpoints don't charge for traffic ingress egress through the endpoint. So if you're one of those people who's trying to watch every penny on your Azure spend, and you have a scenario where you maybe only need to connect to a SQL database or a storage account from like a single VNet, network endpoints can make sense. If you're every other organization I've ever worked with, Private Link makes a lot more sense. There's a new solution from Microsoft. One of the things that I think is a little bit challenging to configure about this, like John mentioned, is DNS. And I know it's every IT joke we always make. It's always DNS, but in this case, it really is. Especially with if you're using like domain controllers through DNS, or even worse, a third-party DNS, because you have to add conditional forwards basically to the Azure DNS service where this is registered, and it's documented in docs. I don't think it's very clearly articulated. One of the reasons why I wanted to record this video is to walk through the process. I think maybe it's something we can blog later to talk about the various ways, depending on what your DNS is, how you configure it. Because I think configuring the private endpoint's easy. Getting DNS right, well, like everything else, because it's always DNS, is probably the slightly more challenging part of this.
Yeah, and there's that one IP address for the DNS services in Azure that you have to forward your DNS traffic to, and I can never remember what it is.
Is that the 169.254?
Yeah, it's that one specific IP address is that where you have to forward all your stuff to.
That's actually a cross-cloud IP metadata resource. So, like in Amazon, it's the same IP. Because I have a bunch of the app I'm working on now. We have a bunch of conditional logic based on whether something's deployed in AWS or not, and I have a bunch of code that like checks that IP and is like, if I get a ping, or there's a metadata endpoint you hit, that hangs off of that IP, and that's how you can tell you're running on a cloud. So yeah, it's the magic cloud IP address.
No, I didn't know that one.
Yeah, it's not. Because I remember Denny telling me about 169.254, and I was like, that's a weird sounding IP address. He's like, yeah, it's Azure. And then when I got into AWS, I was like, oh, I know that IP.
Yeah, and you have to, if I remember right, you have to forward like the address, like database.windows.net or windows.net will forward to that IP address.
Yeah.
Like there's a list of domain names that you forward to that IP address.
And where this gets kind of messy from a DNS perspective, and Denny helped me do this at a customer that we had at DCAC. They had most of their Azure SQL databases were on private link, but they were like connecting to a customer one or something where they had to connect publicly. Because then you just can't forward database.windows.net. You have to like because with a conditional forward, you can use wildcards and stuff. So like you could do star database.windows.net. But the issue was if you're connecting to one on a public endpoint, you need that to resolve from the public to its public IP. So that's the one place this can get a little bit messy, but there are some workarounds there. So one other thing I wanted to mention about that, and I'm struggling to recall at the moment, but let's dive in. John's kind of got a demo set up, and
I do.
We'll walk through it.
Let me share my screen here.
Oh, I remember the thing I wanted to mention. There's a preview feature right now called Network Security Parameter.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's preview, and I didn't want to set it up and walk through it yet, but the goal of this, we're going to demo doing this on a SQL server or an Azure SQL server. It's not that hard to do on a single resource. Where this gets hard is when you're managing, like, you're in an enterprise and you have like 50 of these things, and you have 50 network endpoints, and you have to manage all that stuff. It's that's where it starts to get challenging, and network security perimeters is supposed to help manage that for those kinds of organizations. But I'm going to hand off to John, who's like doing stuff in Azure right now.
I am doing stuff. And so what I've got set up here is I've got a resource group called Azure Demos. I'm going to start to use this resource group to like put resources in, so future videos. But in here, I've got a virtual network called vnet-prod-demos. Remember to always tag your resources. I didn't tag this one, but always go tag your stuff. In here, I've got 3 subnets. I have a subnet for virtual machines. I have a subnet for SQL Server, and that could be SQL Server virtual machines or Azure SQL, don't care. And then I've got one for Azure Bastion. I think Azure Bastion is like probably one of the best things next to sliced bread. And Azure Bastion is going to allow me to RDP into my virtual machines through the browser, so I don't have to open up public IP addresses or RDP or anything like that. I can do it strictly from the browser. I'm actually already in my virtual machine. We can see it here. So I have a host called DB01, and it is running SQL Server if we ever need it, but that's kind of what the setup is. I also have a logical Azure SQL database server called Private Link. I think it's really funny that Microsoft actually allowed me to pick that. If you didn't know, that name has to be globally unique. So I now have privatelink.database.windows.net, and I will have, nobody else can get that name. I have it for eternity, for as long as I have this server, or until Microsoft comes around and says, give it up. Which if they're watching this video, might be soon. Who knows?
I'm really surprised that was not a reserved.
I'm really surprised as well. I was actually struggling to come up with a globally unique name because they're all taken. Like, right? You know, it's like domain squatting in the old days. But I've got this server, and right now it is not on Private Link. And so if I want to do that, I'm going to go into the server blade here and scroll down on the left to networking. And this is where you would set up like your firewall rules to allow connectivity from the outside world, down in here. And you can see my house. There's my public IP. Might want to blur that out, Joey.
Don't worry, Comcast will change it in like 3 days.
That's true. I'm going to click on the private access, and this is where we can set up. And over the years, Microsoft has made it easier. I seem to recall, like, probably 4 years ago, like, to do this, you had to go through this process, then you had to approve it, and then you had to go to the other side on the private endpoint and approve it on the other side of the spectrum to make sure that it works. And it was kind of convoluted.
In my experience, I will warn you, they've made the portal experience better, but if you're doing this using Terraform or
it's still a pain in the ass.
Or Bicep or whatever, you're still going to have to probably execute that code twice.
Yeah. The portal, I think, is really, really easy these days. So I'm going to click create a private endpoint. It's going to default me into my resource group. I'm going to give it a name. And usually I will do like private endpoint SQL DB-01, something like that, right? I'm going to give it a relatively descriptive name so I know what that resource is using it. It's going to create my network interface for me. It's going to drop it into my region.
And always double check your region. It should it should default to the same region, but just make sure.
It's going to automatically target the resource type. In this case, it's Microsoft.SQL/servers. And at the private link.
And then the sub-resource is SQL Server there. And that's that never changes unless your resource type changes. So like if you were creating a storage account, private link, it would be different. But for SQL, always the same thing. Yep.
And I will say that this flow is pretty much the same for storage accounts and key vaults. For the most part, there might be a little bit of nuances here and there, but for the most part, the flow is the same within the portal. It's going to drop me, ask me what VNet I want to drop into. I selected my vnet-prod-demos. I'm going to change this to my SQL Server subnet. I'm going to let it dynamically allocate an IP address because it's a demo. I don't care. And this is where the DNS part is in my opinion, can get convoluted and kind of tricky. If you have any
Can you go
background
back
in
one?
networking, it helps.
Can you go back one screen?
Yeah,
I want to mention something.
yeah.
Application security groups are similar to network security groups, and the only time I've ever learned about them in 15 years of working in Azure was when I took AC 700.
Yeah, I've actually never seen application security groups used.
Yeah, it's typically redundant compared to other functionalities, and it's kind of complex to set up. But I just wanted to mention it because it was on the screen.
That's fair. Fair.
Yeah, and here we are with DNS.
So here we are with DNS. In this case, I don't have a domain controller set up. I don't have a DNS server set up. So I'm going to use Azure DNS. It's going to integrate this private IP address with the private DNS zones in Azure. So it's going to set up a private link database-windows.net. This is my subscription. I've got an Azure sponsored subscription. In my resource group, that should all be fine. And we can actually go look, once this is created, we can go to the private DNS zone and actually see that resource with the appropriate IP address. I'm not going to tag it. I know Joey's probably going to harp on me later.
Well, you should have policy that blocks you from that.
I should.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and create this endpoint. And so right now what it's doing is it's actually taking that logical SQL server. It's going to assign that NIC. You saw it created that network interface card and name for me. Essentially assign that to that server and then attach it to the VNet within that and on that subnet. And it's going to get a 10.100.1. something.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before when we talked about types of network resources, but a virtual NIC is a type of resource. Like one of the things that if you build an Azure VM...
Oh, you dropped your mic.
Yeah, dropped my mic. If you build an Azure VM, the first thing that gets created is the virtual NIC, and then that gets attached, and that's how you get your IP address. So it's just part of kind of the sub resources of a resource, as John's showing here, and it's going to be the same thing with your Azure DB. It's just going to present slightly differently.
Yep. So this is the virtual. To Joy's point, this is the virtual NIC for the VM I created, and it has a 10.100.1.4 address, and it's in that VM's subnet on that VNet. So now we are just waiting for this thing to finish.
And you have a private endpoint, and then it's making your DNS entry.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then, like I said previously, you'd have to go approve this. Like you'd have to deploy this and then go into the private link and approve it on the on two different sides, right? Because there's two ends to the tunnel, and you had to go do like 3 other steps once this is done. Whereas now in the portal, it's super easy. I think it's easy.
And I think one other thing to mention is like when we're creating one resource and we're connecting to it, it's pretty straightforward. Where we've run into bigger challenges. Didn't you have a customer who was like using app services private and then trying to connect to a SQL DB that was also private, and you kind of had to figure where to point DNS in the app service, and that was challenging? Or am I misremembering that?
No, I think that might have been one of Denny's clients.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah. Those kinds of things can get really dicey with DNS. You should be able to navigate to DNS now, because I think you're done.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
So here, and it's a resource, right? So
Yeah.
you can actually go into, if you do a search for private endpoints, it's a resource that you can go see. So you can go see all your private endpoints. You can see that I've got a 10.100.1.5 address. So if I go into private DNS now, private DNS, I have a private link.database.windows.net. And it's worth noting that as you do private link for like storage accounts or Key Vault, you're going to get different zones that are associated to it, right? So you're for like storage account blob storage, you're going to get private link.blob.core.windows.net or something. I don't remember the exact domain, but
yeah. And one thing to note on John's DNS here, since he created the VM, his VM is going to be using Azure DNS by default.
Correct.
Yeah, because he didn't specify. You have to override that in a default VM build.
Yep. So if I have additional logical SQL instances that I want to add private link to, they would show up in here, just another record set in here with a different IP address. And in theory, now, because it's DNS, it might take it a few minutes for, the time to live to filter out and get the new name for the virtual machine. But if I come in here and ping, nope, yeah, I can ping that. No, it's not Windows.net. I can't find it yet.
Yeah.
So it might take time for it to. Not telling it.
TNC.
So it might take time for it to filter out for this VM to actually.
Well, can you ping the IP though?
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah. Try one last thing. You're in PowerShell. Yeah, cool. Do TNC. This is testnet connection. Do the IP and then dash port 1433.
Waiting.
Yeah. This is slow generally, even if it works. So it might not be ready. The fun thing about networking, especially cloud networking, is it is not always synchronous.
Yeah.
You got there. You can connect. We're just waiting on DNS.
Yeah, we're just waiting on DNS.
So if you really wanted to force the issue, you could edit etc host and
yeah, edit the host file.
oh God, remember that client?
Yes. I remember that client.
We have this client that made big use of host files, and which is fine, I guess, except they didn't tell us.
Nope.
Yeah.
So sudo demo fail. We at least could reach it.
Reboot your VM. We will see if we can get this working. There's some weirdness about DNS and Azure about picking up, and it might require a reboot. If not, it buys us a few minutes to see if it works.
That's true. Well, it was pseudo successful because we could ping that IP address.
Yeah, so you can. And also the fact that you're not resolving the public IP address.
That's right.
So when you're connecting, if it was still publicly available, you would see that you'd get a public IP address back.
Yeah, and I can't remember. The ping actually might not succeed, but it would resolve.
It should resolve. Yeah, I don't think the ping's going to succeed. That's why testnet connection is good. I kind of didn't mention that. I shared with John a default alias for test network connection, TNC, which test network connection is kind of like modern Windows version of Telnet. I still use Telnet a lot because I use a Mac. And we don't have... Oddly, testnet connection has some dependency on WinForms. Yeah, it's still not resolving. Hey, we're back. We kind of paused there for a minute to figure out some stuff that was broken in our demo, and it turns out once again we've broken stuff in Azure, which is always fun. John, I'll let you kind of walk through this.
So, yeah, we broke it, but not really. It's kind of like it makes sense now that we kind of understand what's going on. You'll remember that we're kind of joking that we can't believe that we could actually pick like private link.database.windows.net. That resource as a SQL logical instance exists. Like we can use it to serve databases and serve connectivity. However, because you'll notice at the top, the private DNS zone is also private link.database.windows.net.
It's not called that because that was our database server name.
Yeah.
It defaults to that. John, if you want to share that doc.
It does default to that. You can see here in this documentation, and Joey, we should probably include a link to this doc.
Yeah, I'll throw it in the
private DNS zone is leave the default of private link.database.windows.net. We think that is causing a conflict, and so as a test, we actually created a second server called Blod01. That's a great naming convention of mine. And we assigned it an IP address of 10.100.1.6. You can see it there in the value column right there. And then see if we can resolve it. And so if I go back to my screen, actually, and I ping blah01.database.windows.net, I should get it resolved to 10.100.1.6. However, if I try that with private link, I still can't get it resolved. So with the secondary demo of blah 01, the private link works, and we get a private IP address, and so now all that traffic is routing within that particular VNet and subnet. So all the traffic is staying within that logical
Hey,
VNet.
John, rerun that NS lookup. Like if you up arrow, you should, or yeah, just
Which one?
the private link.
I can type.
And NS lookup's going to give us the IP for a DNS entry, and you'll see here we get like a 168.63 as opposed to here we'll get our specific private URL.
Whoops.
Yeah.
Yep. So we can get that non-authoritative answer down below. That's what we would expect. But we pseudo broke. I suspect that we're going to email Microsoft.
We'll email the PG and see if we can get. Well, honestly, what should happen is they should block you from creating private link.database.windows.net because you're going to break.
Or
it's one of those things where I don't know what could potentially downstream break because I don't know enough about their architecture, but it seems not good that they let you do that.
Well, and or anything else like private link.blob. Like your storage accounts and all that stuff. Like there's probably other areas
on that. Yeah. So we learned a lot through breaking Azure as usual. And thank you for joining us. And we'll be back with some other stuff. Like and subscribe. Any famous last words?
Don't use private link.database.windows. Well, nobody can now because I've got the
John's got the server, but
I got the server.
Yeah, we'll email the PG and maybe post an update later if we figure it out.
Definitely take a look if you want to further secure your virtual networks in Azure. As you saw, it's relatively easy to set up. I highly recommend it. I like it.
Yeah, it's something, especially if you work in a larger company, you're going to be tasked with doing this. Yeah. So it's kind of important to understand like how it works.
Yeah.
And this,
I would also say that this is another emphasis on, we're old school DBAs, but we had to come forward and learn networking in the cloud, and these are skills that as a DBA I need to know.
Yeah, for sure. So cool. Well, thanks everyone. Like I said, like and subscribe. Join us for some of our other videos, and thanks for your time.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.